you should have a message popping up on your screen to say that it's okay to record. So I will now turn over to my colleague, Professor Damien Giorco, Professor of Resource Stewardship at the Institute for Sustainable Futures and also Deputy Director Research at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at UTS. Damien, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and very, very pleased to be here with you. So distinguished guests, Deputy Director Boonpala, fellow colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our first research seminar on the garment sector of the future, being jointly hosted by the Institute for Sustainable Futures here at UTS, University of Technology, Sydney, and the International Labour Organisation. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City Campus stands. And on behalf of us all, I pay respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge elders as traditional custodians of knowledge for this place. And furthermore, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all ancestral lands from which we each join today and pay respects to elders across those lands. Again, a very, very warm welcome to everyone online, and thank you for being here with us today. The partnership between the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures and the ILO, working with Dr. Cristina Martinez, the Regional Senior Specialist for Environment and Decent Work, began more than 4 years ago with foundational research undertaken as part of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency project, Decent Work in the garment sector in Asia. So it's fitting that as UTS and ILO look to further formalise our partnership through a Memorandum of Understanding, that our first joint seminar arises from this project. I would like to especially welcome SIDA colleagues on the line. SIDA and Sweden are important development partners in the region, and we have collaborated with Swedish partners, including via the Swedish-Australian Innovation, Technology and Design Summit, which is happening again at UTS in September this year. At the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures, we pursue a mission to create change towards sustainable futures. And overwhelmingly, this happens in partnership. Partnering to deliver change represents real impact from our research, impact that improves our economy, society, environment, or culture, whether through fostering sustainable practices, collaborating to improve regulations, building capacity of actors in the economy, or delivering on real social change, such as increasing decent work, which I know is at the forefront of ILO activities. And pleasingly, UTS is getting recognised for this impact in the 2022 Times Higher Education Impact Ranking. UTS was ranked 15th in the world, second in Australia, for contributing to advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, and indeed for SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, UTS was ranked 3rd globally. At the Institute for Sustainable Futures, ISF, our transdisciplinary PhD scholars are really an integral part of driving research which creates change. And we currently have more than 50 PhD scholars who are researching sustainability in varied fields and contexts. And for us, these doctoral scholars are critical to new knowledge creation and enhancing the research industry policy interface, because over the course of their studies, they'll engage within and across disciplines to bring new insights on the systemic interactions of organisational and technical and cultural and social innovation in a way that really is hard for most of us in the course of our day jobs to do comprehensively. We really look to our doctoral scholars to highlight those areas of transformational change, both during the research, and know that they'll also play an important role in bringing to fruition that change in society once they graduate. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Katerina and Karina talk about their respective work in the garment sector. Katerina on the importance of multi-stakeholder dialogues, and particularly thinking about how we make these dialogues effective and the agents of change that we want them to be. and Karina, who is exploring regenerative business models in the sector. What do these look like? How can they be enabled? In the sector that really started the Industrial Revolution, can we look to the garment sector to be a frontrunner for the types of new business models and practices that we will need to achieve sustainability? Really hope you find today's jointly hosted seminar engaging, and I would now like to invite Ms. Panura Bunpala, Deputy Regional Director of the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific for the International Labour Organization, to make some opening comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Damien Giorgio, Deputy Director, Research Institute for Sustainable Future, University Technology, Sydney. Distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. We are so pleased to be part of this event today. And Professor, thank you again for your very nice welcoming words. The ILO is very delighted to see this event convened today as part of the ILO Sweden regional project, the Decent Work in Garment Supply Chains in Asia. This is our 4-year initiative aimed at strengthening regional knowledge, exchange and action to close decent work deficits in the garment industry in Asia. The project focuses on a few important themes, just as gender equality, productivity, and environmental sustainability. Its approach combines knowledge generation with regional exchange, learning and advocacy, together with new and improved tools to help industry partners adopt scalable actions across the supply chain. To date, the project has registered several important success, in particular in generating and applying industry knowledge through high quality research and guidance. The project also has built capacity of women's leadership through training and mentoring. The project has support enterprise level productivity through a scalable safe learning toolkit. And also at the regional level, last year, the tripartite participants and constituents in the region come together at the regional level meeting to discuss the future of work in this sector. So you can see that this is really vibrant. The industry is important. The project also has connected the industry with the Asia Garment Hub, which is the industry first digital knowledge platform for decent work resources. And also the project continues to expand on regional exchange and learning through online events, through e-discussion, thematic task force and networks. And in particular, today's event falls under the project's environmental sustainability theme, where the project has been working closely with your institute to develop tools and also insight to support the industry in making a just transition to a green future. Colleagues, as we all know, our region is set to play a key role in implementing the goals to transition towards net zero emissions and increase resilience as required by the Paris Agreement. But we also know that time is short. Globally, the window to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 is rapidly closing. Current greenhouse gas discharges from the textile production already stands at 1.2 billion tons annually and are significant as 7% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Also, the textiles could account for more than a quarter of global CO2 emissions by 2050, according to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. One way to help tackle this issue before time runs out is via the reform of the textile and garment sector in Asia. Here, fashion sector stakeholders came together in 2018 to form the Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action, committing up to 30% emission reduction by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050, aspiring for a higher climate ambition where partnership leads the way to succeed. The webinar will show how science, industry, policy partnerships can provide innovation by joint programs that deep dive into the core of the reforms that the textile and garment industry in Asia must consider to ensure green development through just transition planning. Entering the recovering period of the COVID-19, we believe that the garment sector in the Asia region has real opportunity to work on just transition planning that is based on evidence, that is built on strong social dialogue to ensure protection for workers, plus investment in enterprise growth and productivity that can benefit all in the supply chain. We will hear more from Katarina and also Karina in their presentation this afternoon. I'd like to thank the Institute for Sustainable Futures for their partnership with the ILO in supporting this research and our work to improve environmental and social outcomes throughout the textile and garment supply chain in Asia. And finally, I'd like to thank SIDA for the generous support to our project, without whom this work could not be completed. And I also would like to thank for the partnership, support and commitment to among all stakeholders who are here with us today, but also many others who are not here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Director. Now it's my pleasure to ask Katarina Vem to share her presentation. And just while Katarina is getting her slides on the screen, I thought I would just say a little bit about the PhD process that that Katarina and Karina are now undertaking. So PhD studies or doctoral studies requires 3 years full-time research or the equivalent part-time, and it involves systematic, rigorous, ethical research processes that make original and substantial contributions to new knowledge in the scholar's respective fields. So it's a really serious undertaking to go deep into a particular issue and push the frontiers of knowledge in that issue. And both Katarina and Karina are partway through this process, but have already have some significant things to say about the future of the garment sector. So Katarina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you, everybody. I am really happy to present my research here today. The UTS PhD program is world-renowned for its interdisciplinary approach, and I'm honored to be enrolled as a researcher, but also the fact that it is within the ILO SIDA project. The value of research should not be underestimated, especially when we're trying to address some of the environmental challenges that are beginning to limit human well-being. Let's see, it's not clicking there. We need to critically investigate approaches that affect the biosphere in destructive proportions. The SDGs are guiding us on what to focus on, but how do we know that what we're doing is the right thing? Researching and analyzing what has been done in the past can partly help us provide useful guidance. The textile industry is facing numerous challenges, and in my research, I'm investigating how the building of robust economies is happening at the expense of severe environmental degradation. I'm investigating how multi-stakeholder platforms are trying to improve skills and awareness in factories by critically assessing the success of a number of initiatives in order to ascertain which common features provide positive results. What does it mean that developing countries are trying to build robust economies? Employment, decent work, decent living conditions, social stability, these are all aspects of development that are valued. But the expense of environmental degradation, let's look at a historical evolution of the textile industry. It's a backdrop with valuable lessons. The growth of the textile industry in Britain and North America is known as the Industrial Revolution, happened between 1760 and 1840. The US industry outgrew the British as the cotton could be produced in the South and imports were not necessary. At the time, the US population was approximately 31 million. In Britain, with a population of 33 million, the textile industry contributed to GDP growth at a time of poverty and deterioration for the largely uneducated population. In summary, the technical evolution helped to alleviate poverty. The large workforce employed in the new industrial context influenced the emergence of trade unions, the unions that we see as a model for all unions in the world today. So undoubtedly, the textile industry has contributed to a large increase in per capita income and increased access to consumer goods in numerous countries. In Sweden, the textile industry emerged in the early 19th century, quite late, when the population was a mere 4 million. Industrialization was small and slow and kept on until 1950s, when the competition from the modernizing Western European industry rendered most of the workforce obsolete. The textile industry was then dismantled from the end of the 1960s to about mid-1970s. But the Swedish industry was a very tiny one compared to the one causing the Industrial Revolution. But it is worth keeping in mind as it helps us understand the proportions of the challenges. It provides an interesting benchmark and illustrates what we are facing if the pollution from the textile industry is not prevented. 70,000 people worked in the textile industry in Sweden when the industry was dismantled. And the picture here shows the river of the textile hub, Borås. It looks pretty, but the water is so polluted that the inhabitants are warned from swimming in this river. The pre-study that was recently initiated will take 3 years at an initial cost of $3.5 million US. It will provide a more precise estimate regarding the cost of cleaning up the river and who is responsible, which is actually a dialogue that started already in the late 1800s, but is unresolved until this day. It's estimated that there's about 250,000 cubic meters of contaminants, zinc, chromium, mercury, dioxins at the river bottom. In the 60s, when the industry was dismantled, the estimate for remediation was approximately $1 million. Today, they're estimating that the costs have gone up about 100-fold to $100 million at least. This is an estimate. The cost for remediation is daunting. The Swedish industry was small compared to the industry in Bangladesh. Sweden is a large, sparsely populated country. We have approximately 10 million inhabitants on a land area that is twice the size of the UK. Bangladesh, on the other hand, the environmental degradation is severe. The polluted lands and waterways in a country that is that 1/3 of the size of Sweden, but with a population of 166 million, and 4 million of them work in the textile industry. Is this really the way we want to build our economies, depleting its resources? The textile and apparel industry is a significant contributor to the world economy. It has one of the largest, longest, and most complicated global supply chains. But is this the way we want to go? We cannot afford that. Kate Raworth's Donut Economics critiques traditional economic theories and shows how they're misguided and proposes that there's a need to strive for balance. The theory postulates that a thriving human existence is only possible by careful use of available resources. If we use too much, we risk catastrophic events. Using Earth's resources unwisely will lead to a shortfall, with humanity existing in danger and hardship. From my research, these are exactly the challenges that are facing Bangladesh today. Environmental degradation of the textile industry globally, and of course specifically in Bangladesh, are challenging. Polluting effluents on land and water, bringing the water downstream to communities that live along the rivers where they wash, swim, where crops are grown and animals drink. In Bangladesh, the rivers run into the ocean, also affecting marine life and organisms that are further consumed by the population. These are immediate effects, but it's also estimated that by 2050, 1 in every 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced because of climate change. Specifically, with a projected 50 centimeter sea rise level. Bangladesh may lose approximately 11% of its land by then, and up to 18 million people may have to migrate because of the sea level rise. The pressures are disproportionate and exemplify the need for immediate action. It exemplifies the characteristic of the new geologic age, the Anthropocene, where biosphere resilience that has supported development and civilizations can no longer be taken for granted. Resilience research describes the need for transformational change in several drivers of global dynamics, including the current economic system, the trend of homogenization of social ecological landscapes, and the subsequent decline in diversity. Population size, growth and density challenges, consumption patterns, human ethics and behavior. The topics are numerous, but policy that highlights interrelationships between the biosphere and the prosperous development of society today needs to create space for flexible, innovative collaboration that will ensure sustainability. The response to many of the challenges that for a long time already have been facing the textile industry has been through numerous multi-stakeholder platforms. In my research, I analyzed the aims and the results of 3 initiatives: Partnership for Cleaner Textiles, Sweden Textile Water Initiative, and Better Mill Initiative. And the focus of my analysis is the work that they have done in Bangladesh. By analyzing reports, a variety of background material, followed by interviews, I expect to get material that allows me to draw out crucial elements. I will develop a framework for my analysis, which builds on the Wayfinder methodology. And Wayfinder is developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, Resilience Alliance, and Australian Resilience Center. And it follows a 5-step process with progressive modules, which are continuously evaluated. And I think this methodology will help me design a framework to evaluate the coalition building, the aspirations of the initiatives, the social ecological interactions, the dialogues, and the strategies for innovative solutions. And this is a key to learning about how to apply multi-stakeholder platforms in the future. So why is this important? Well, since the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002, a proliferation of various multi-stakeholder mechanisms have emerged. Platforms, processes, partnerships, networks, and the idea behind them has its origin in Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize award-winning work, which demonstrated how resources can be sustainably and equitably governed when stakeholders come together to collaborate. MSPs, multi-stakeholder platforms, they aim to improve stakeholder dialogues to reach agreement despite different baselines and views on a variety of topics. They can be broadly defined as working relationships between organizations from different sectors, combining resources and competences, sharing risks towards achieving agreed shared objectives, whilst they also have to achieve their own individual objectives. Representatives from different interest groups discuss shared challenges opportunities, actions, and strategies. They have the potential to tackle complex development challenges and to assist in the scaling up of necessary innovations. But the aim is of all to move forward with actions that everyone can agree on, and that not only the stakeholders in the platform agree on, but that goes beyond that as well. Civil society organization, and increasingly the UN system, is emphasizing the inequities and the need for policies that prevent pollution, which risk impacting developing nations the hardest. And in this regard, I believe that I hope my research will show that multi-stakeholder platforms will be a useful way forward. One of the primary and shared aims is capacity building. Capacity building is instrumental in improving conditions for workers as well as communities, and requires policy dialogues as well. Topics such as environmental management systems, process improvements, CO2 emissions, and numerous regulatory adherence challenges are all shared by the initiatives. But there's also a specific need for skilled technical advisory services locally. And I think that improving labor and environmental management in the textile industry seems to be of significant importance. But the knowledge and skill level at the factory level, but also among technical consultants in South Asia, is quite limited. To strengthen knowledge transfer, experiences from other sectors, knowledge-intensive business services could be useful. With my research, I hope to address questions that link to the multitude of multi-stakeholder platforms that are active today. SDG 17 encourages us to collaborate in partnerships. But how do we know that the partnerships are legitimate and not greenwashing for appearance's sake? How are criteria, quality, and evaluation performed, and by whom? Who has the mandate to evaluate? The challenges to the textile industry are generational. How can initiatives be ensured consistent long-term commitment? Since many of the initiatives are funded by public funds, how do we evaluate that this is all done well and by whom? And I think as an example of research, I end this presentation with numbers of questions that the work that I will be doing in the coming years hopefully will bring an answer to. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Katarina. I would now like to welcome Karina to share her presentation. So also just a reminder that we're going to have both presentations back to back. And so if you have any questions that have come up in the course of Katarina's presentation, please pop them into the chat and we'll come back to those later in the session. So Karina, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share my research with you. I'm looking at regenerative businesses today, and I'll share with you what I've found so far. And my overall topic for my research is to weave narratives of transformation in the fashion and textile sector towards regenerative cultures. So overall, I'll look at the dominant business model. Then we'll move into what are systems transformation and the possibility of what's living systems thinking and regenerative design and development has for businesses within the fashion and textile industry. So as Katarina has told us so much about what's happening within the industry and its effects, the current dominant business model that's driving many of these negative effects is the fast fashion model, which has global supply chains. It's characterized by consumption-focused growth, high quantities of disposable and cheap quality clothing, and it focuses on speed to market based on trends and short-term shareholder returns. It also is predicated on the perceived needs of customers. Move some things around. So the impact of the industry, as we've heard so far, is that it's resource depleting. It also is contributing immensely to climate change. It also contributes to animal suffering, water pollution, food insecurity, air pollution, habitat destruction, and human rights abuses. As we saw with COVID-19, and we're still seeing the effects of, that we are deepening our appreciation of how unpredictable and complex these systems are, and how highly interconnected they are, and creating challenges that are becoming our new norm. Business as usual is creating systems that are not resilient, and they are not meeting the real needs or wants of the stakeholders, and that's everyone. The system is highly complex, and fashion systems are really exciting, an exciting place to be, because they connect us to culture and identity, the history, to education, to the future of work, to innovation, design and technology, economics, ecology, as well as the health, as we've seen, and materials. And though they are complicit with so many issues that we're facing today, they also have the potential to be the catalyst for systems change. So what is systems change? What we're looking for is a whole transformation, actually, not just an incremental change, but a serious transformation. And that comes about through a whole systems view. So looking at practical changes, so the practical sphere, which is behaviours and technology, but also political systems and structures, as well as our own personal beliefs, the beliefs and values and worldviews that actually create all of the world that we live in. And as Albert Einstein wisely said in many different ways, the world we have created is the product of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. So one way of thinking that is coming about and becoming more prevalent is through systemic research, is that of living systems thinking. It looks at life that has been developing life for 3.8 billion years on this planet. And perhaps we have something to learn here from life itself. So living systems are open systems that are able to self-generate and interact with their environment, and they're relational. This interaction takes place by means of information and material energy exchanges. Living systems start at the micro level, from cells, that each of our cells within our bodies are, up to the individual level, so humans, plants, animals, and to social systems as well, organizations, nations, and at the ecological level of forests, oceans, and the planet as a whole. So if you look at living systems principles, we start looking at wholes. We start looking at how they interrelate and how they're interdependent. They're also mutualistic, so they value their value is inherent, and their dependence is in one another. They're unique, so they have the possibility of individual genius. They're evolutionary, so they're dynamic and ever-changing in the environmental conditions. They're also nodal, which means that they're distributed and also decentralized, and they're developmental. And this is really important for all of us to understand, that we as living systems, we sense in wholes. We actually see in patterns and processes and qualities of the system. We're in constant relationship with one another, and we seek cooperation, and we also evolve through cooperation. We also thrive in diversity and our uniqueness. So what does this mean for business or designing our systems? So currently, our designs are really based on technical systems where we value quantity and we value efficiency. We value doing things right, getting things right. And that's informed by mechanistic, technological, and siloed and fragmented thinking, which has got us to so many great things. However, it's not going to get us to a regenerative and a living, thriving world. So if we take instead a living systems approach, we start to value and pay attention to the quality and quantity. We also look at efficiency, but also the effectiveness of doing the right thing. We're informed by a living systems view, and we think in patterns and principles. We start to do things as nature. This way of thinking and developing has the potential to enliven our organizations and industries. It also is a way that we can move in coherence with living systems that are complex, adaptive, and emergent. We come into relationship with our environment. The business models that relate to this way of thinking start to change how we think of, our business models start to change. So instead of being business as usual, where business is outside of the environment and society, where shareholder value is maximized through profits and through the extraction and exploitative processes, we start to move towards sustainable thinking, which is the triple bottom line, where we start to hybridize our thinking and create shared value. But with regenerative thinking, what happens is we actually change our position in society and in the environment, where business is actually in service to society and in turn in service to our environment, but it's in deep relationship. This way of thinking creates relationships that are interconnected, interdependent, and where our businesses are actually integrated into our society and our environment. The business no longer defines itself solely within its factory walls, but instead defines itself through its relationships and the impact that its decisions and actions have on their local environment and their local communities. Right. The structure within the business as well changes. When we go from conventional thinking, which is hierarchical and also centralized, it's transactionally focused and focused on command and control and predictions inspired by the machine, which are very fragile and open to systemic shock. We start to go to a living systems way of being, which is networked, it's relational, it's responsive and adaptive. The factories are designed to be regenerative. So internally, they build the capacities and the capabilities of their staff to understand the whole system. Staff, while they have their own skill set that is important and creates a system as a whole when they're in relationship to one another, the company actually looks to ask of its employees what is required. It also asks of its customers what they need. So all of a sudden, we aren't just looking at a single business, but we're looking at a whole ecosystem of enterprises, which includes not only the factory, but also the customer, the fiber grower, and also all the stakeholders along the whole supply chain, which are networked together. Teams work together in collaborative means. They don't work from a hierarchical leadership management role. Instead, they self-organize. The fashion brand in this scenario is no longer just a fashion brand. They're also the factory, and they also work towards contributing in ways that are different to what a conventional fashion house does. They're the factory, but they're also sustainability consultants. One brand that I've spoken to through my studies, because they were so far ahead with their sustainability understanding and also their processes, one of their customers asked them to write the policy for their procurement. Also, the customer suddenly is not just the customer, but also the supplier when we look at textile recycling as an example. The textile recycler asks for the materials directly from companies that are in need of disposing of used garments, and they work in collaboration. This changes the whole understanding of who is the customer and who is the supplier, and changes that relationship as well. A relationship is built on trust and shared understanding of what is valued within the system. Another way to perceive this is through how capital flows. So conventionally, capital flows mostly to financial capital in the conventional business model. Capital pools are depleted to grow financial capital in return for the owners. However, if we look at multiple capital flows where we see intellectual capital, spiritual capital, social capital, material capital, financial capital, living capital, cultural capital, all on equal ground, then our stakeholders become our central focus. All stakeholders' investment and contributions are valued. They're networked and distributed and reciprocal, and this creates resilience. Our leadership is not top down, as we said before, but they're not managers, but resources, not only for themselves, but for their colleagues and their wider communities. They develop the personal and social skills aligned with living systems being. They develop a culture of care, which emulates throughout the whole system. Our regenerative leadership is not about management, it's a role that is distributed throughout the system. So our roles are changing, and the fashion industry has the potential to really become self-aware of itself, but also of the systems in which it's associated and also embedded in. And in turn, this will help us to engage in a way that is going to create systems actualization. We have the capacity within ourselves and the capabilities to care for ourselves, develop our sense of belonging and responsibility to our living systems and our communities, and to endeavour to be in service to life. I really believe that the fashion system has the potential, and through my research, I hope to uncover that potential and also the ways in which we will see how fashion businesses are already leading the way towards sustainable futures. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Karina. There's a lot to think about there. I know when I reflect back to the beginning of this, the SIDA project, the Decent Work in Garment Supply Chains in Asia project, you know, change really comes quite rapidly to the garment sector. So 4 years ago, when we started talking about this project, circular economy for textiles and garments was really a niche consideration, as was eco-design principles. Definitely thinking about, you know, the systematic application of eco-design principles. But here we are only 4 years later, and, you know, circular principles are emerging as core strategies for many brands. And we have eco-design as part of the new EU textile strategy. And I think the field of regenerative business and regenerative business models will have a similarly rapid advancement in the thinking of the sector. Okay, well, that ends our presentations component of the meeting today. We now go to our two discussants. I'm not sure if one of them has been able to join us. Lindita, I don't know if you're on the line.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
I am here.
Perfect. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
So Lindita is from the UNFCCC Fashion Charter. Would you like to, I guess, introduce yourself and I guess maybe say a little bit about the work of the Fashion Charter mostly in the recent period of time, because I know there's been a lot of work underway since COP last year. So, and then also please make some reflections or comments on the presentations. So over to you.
I hope thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me well. I am we're in Copenhagen. Actually, we just had our annual meeting of Fashion Charter signatories, and we are currently in the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, which brings together around 400 executives and sustainability heads of sustainability from all these different companies and brands and suppliers in the fashion industry. So I am sorry for the background noise if you hear it. So my name is Lindita, and I lead sectoral engagement in climate action within UNFCCC, and fashion industry is one of them. The fashion industry has its own fashion industry charter for climate action, which is basically hosted by us, but this is an industry-led initiative. So what we do is we make sure that there's the right ambition level, that the right accountability mechanisms are put in place, and that discussions that are happening under different technical working groups are actually done in an inclusive and transparent way. So this is what we as UNFCCC make sure happens, whereas all the technicalities of what kind of solution they apply, where of course it's up to individual companies who will have their own preferences anyway to decide, who they want to work with, what solutions they want to take on, and so forth. So the fashion industry's charter has a vision that is to drive the fashion industry to net zero emissions no later than 2050. If you look at the charter document in itself, it commits organizations that sign it to halt their emissions by 2030. If halving emissions by 2030 does not seem very scientific to them, although we have guidelines, we ask them to then set publicly science-based targets. So go through the process of setting science-based targets aligned with 1.5 degree. Other commitments include having these companies think about the plans and how are they going to actually implement these targets, in particular by 2030. What is it going to look like? How will this reduction happen? What are they going to do in relation to their supply chain? Obviously, scope 3 emissions, where a majority of impact will lie. And then there's commitments there that ask companies to really look at coming up with 100% renewable electricity for owned and operated emissions, looking at phasing out coal by 2030, and not installing new coal-fired power plants from next year, January next year. Then there's commitments there around really looking at scaling sustainable transport, looking at things, policy advocacy for net zero solutions, things like working with the financial sector to also ensure that there's potential for green investments and so forth. So really looking at all different aspects of the supply chain. And I should also not forget the issue of raw materials, right? And looking to see how can we provide guidance for low carbon materials, but actually we don't know what low carbon materials is. So there's a lot of work that we're doing to try and understand what do we mean by these different definitions, and can we credibly say that a material is low carbon? Right now it doesn't seem to be the case, but also if we look at concepts like regenerative and so forth, what does that actually mean? to what extent actions that are taken can be deemed credible, because there's a lot of claims, of course, as we all know. So it's really to try and come up with that understanding and get to industry consensus on when can we claim that a material is sustainable. And also looking at the circular elements a little bit, but not too much, just because there's a lot of things happening already outside. So this is the Fashion Charter. I think one of the things that we as UNFCCC wanted to facilitate this year, if possible, was to look at how can we work with a wider UN system and UN agencies as well to set up some roundtables or dialogues that would be, of course, of a very constructive nature, but bringing in the knowledge that the industry has and bringing in policymakers and of course, the resources and ideas that they have about how can we define that collective action in terms of the right policies in place, and figuring out, investment needs and figuring out solutions that are available. How can we use the platform of the Fashion Charter to scale green energy in the supply chain? How can we use the NDC process to make those linkages somehow become more institutionalized? In what way can we, of course, draw some of the lessons that we are getting from, let's say, suppliers in countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, Pakistan, and so forth. So yes, this is very much kind of a broad brushed overview of the Fashion Charter. We have just launched a coal phase out action group where 16 companies have committed to sharing their suppliers that are based on factories that are based on coal, and trying to come up with solutions there as well. Really diving into the technical aspects of what is the timeline, what kind of substitutes exist. We have to make sure that we're not going to, phase out coal, but lock in a very something that will then prevent us to achieve the net zero goal. So we have to make sure that the solutions that are that will be applied as a substitute are actually well thought. I think one thing that we also wanted to discuss in a series of workshop is what does it mean to come up with supplier incentives? Because in some cases we see companies saying to suppliers, you either get these targets or we're not going to buy from you anymore. And maybe that's not the most constructive way, of course. So the question then is whether, what do those incentives look like? Maybe preferential contracts, maybe financial incentives, maybe some capacity building. So there can be many different ways, but also we want to see how does this just transition element and the common but differentiated responsibilities apply in these contexts. So there's lots of conversations happening in all these different aspects that I've just mentioned now. So I will stop here for now. In terms of the presentation, I could only listen to the last 5 minutes. I think I am very sorry. I know Nicholas is more informed about this than me, but we had to make a change at the very last minute. So I apologize for that, but I am very happy to provide comments on online if you can send us the recording of the call. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindita. And yes, no, thank you very much for being with us today. And I understand that there was a very late change, and it was probably came whilst you were asleep at night last night. So very, very thankful that you can join us. And yes, we're also really interested and excited to have had some conversations with Nicholas about potentially aligning those roundtables or workshops with our just transition planning processes, because I think properly and adequately planning for just transitions, so in a way that leaves no one behind, whether this is workers or the enterprises, particularly some of the smaller scale enterprises in the production centres in Asia, is really critical in terms of being able to get that transition right. So thank you very much for your comments and and the update on the Fashion Charter, and watch in interest definitely the work of the Cough Phase Out Action Group, and yes, also into the discussions around supplier incentives.
Yes, thank you very much. And also maybe if I can just add one last thing, the concept of the just transition, right? Where I think we haven't really managed to identify properly what that means. And I think it would be good if we can come up with at least some high level principles about, you know, what that just transition means and entails. And of course, as concepts, people know what they are. But I think sometimes when it comes to climate action, for example, the ambition that we have in the charter is the same for everybody. Is that right? You know, do we need to think about another timeline, maybe for countries who are maybe having to also deal with adaptation impacts and not just. So it's really a lot to talk about and a lot of food for thought, and we'd welcome, of course, to collaborate with you on that in these coming months.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindita.
Thank you.
I would like to now ask Anne Zybath from ILO Better Work Global to also come into the discussion and say a little bit about ILO Better Work Global's work and also make some remarks on the presentation. So please, Anne, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to participate today. And thanks to all the speakers that have presented so far. It's been super interesting, quite thought-provoking in many ways. I thought I would start with just a little bit of basic information about Better Work in case there are people here who are not familiar with the program. We are a partnership program of the ILO and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And we work with governments, with trade unions, with employer organizations, with employers and workers, and with international brands in an effort to improve the working conditions in garment factories in developing countries, and also to enhance competitiveness. The program started in 2001 in Cambodia, grew out of a trade agreement between the US and Cambodia. And currently we are in 12 countries. Our biggest programs are in Asia. So we are in Bangladesh, still Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. We've recently started programs in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And in Africa, we are in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Madagascar. And we also have programs in Jordan, Haiti, and Nicaragua. So for us, it's quite interesting, and I'm very happy to hear that a lot of the focus is in Asia, not surprisingly, and that there will definitely be some overlap with some of the countries where we have a presence. Across those countries, we are working in about 1,700 factories, and we reach about 2.4 million workers. So what do we do? A lot of our work is actually focused right at the factory level. That's sort of how the program initiated. So we work with factories. We go in and we do assessments where we look at whether the factory is compliant with national labor law and international labor standards. We provide reports to the factory and to their buyers on just how they're doing in that regard. And we also publish some of that information publicly on our website. We provide what we call advisory services. So through advisory services, we're working together with the factories to try to help them improve the working conditions and also to address the non-compliances that we identify during assessments. And as part of the advisories, we really make an effort to try to create and develop healthy social dialogue at the enterprise level. So that when we are doing the advisory services and working with the factories to try to improve the conditions, that we're working not just with the employers, but also with worker representatives. We also do quite a bit of training for workers, for managers, for supervisors on, you know, a whole range of topics from sexual harassment to, you know, chemical safety. As a result of particularly the assessment work that we do, we have managed to generate a lot of data. So we have a lot of data on working conditions across all of our factories. And with that data, we do research internally inside Better Work. And we also share the data with researchers. So we have external researchers using our data to do their own independent research. We have looked at factories and identified good practices. We share those across factories within countries and across countries. And then more and more, we're working also at the national or sectoral level, still focusing on the garment sector. And we try to, you know, we can enter into policy discussions and influence policy largely as a result of this huge amount of data and research that we've been able to generate over the years. We also provide capacity building for constituents. So we provide trainings in some cases for the ministries of labor, labor inspectors, also for employers and unions. We are just now entering a new strategic phase. And as part of the forward-looking planning for that, for this new phase that we're going to come into, we've identified a number of priority themes that we see as focus areas. One is gender. I heard gender mentioned earlier. Also, social dialogue. That's sort of really fundamental to the way we work and to ensuring that the work that we do is you know, sustainable over time. And we focus on social dialogue at the factory level, as I mentioned, also at the sectoral level. So when we go into a country and set up a program, we work to create what we call a project advisory committee, which includes representatives of government. It's mostly the ministries of labor, but can be Ministry of Industry or Trade, employer organizations, and trade unions. So we're also working to facilitate social dialogue at the sectoral level. We also, as one of our priority themes, we identified working on the labor aspects of environmental sustainability and circularity. So this is really where we see Better Work coming into the environmental sphere, is focusing on the connection between impacts on workers and environmental. It can be environmental degradation, but it can also be measures that are being taken to address environmental problems. So, for example, with climate change and global warming, you know, there are going to be increasing negative effects on workers through heat stress. So we look to sort of make that connection back to primarily to the workers. Also with circularity, I mean, if circularity really takes full force, there are going to be likely some very significant changes on employment in terms of workforces. They're going to be shifted, I would say globally, but also in terms of required skill sets. That's going to change. So that would be our focus, is looking at the sort of how these two things come together. Now, how do we see that we might enter into the space? So we, as I mentioned, we work across a diverse range of stakeholders, and we have quite a bit of experience in sort of as a convener, bringing different stakeholders together, getting them to engage in dialogue, and hopefully, you know, with the result being a sort of productive outcome. So that's one thing that we think we could do. And we've thought about, you know, with these project advisory committees, perhaps we want to bring in officials from, for example, the Ministry of Environment, so that we broaden the conversation and bring together the labor and environment issues. We also, as I mentioned, do a lot of training and capacity building. And so that's another area that we see that we could contribute. Now, we are really labor focused. We have been since the beginning. We don't have the internal expertise, and we're not in technical, you know, environmental specialists. But so we would most certainly be working in partnership with others throughout this work, bringing in people that do have the expertise, but we could be the ones facilitating and, like I say, and bringing different people together. We do see some potential for us to try to promote environmentally friendly production processes at the factory level. This is something we would almost certainly do also in partnership with others, even including others within the ILO. So there are programs, other programs in the ILO that also have an environmental focus, or at least to some degree, we could work with them. And we see that we might be able to contribute by enhancing the collaboration and the coordination across initiatives. I mean, one thing that we've noticed when we've sort of taken a look at the work that's going on in the environmental sphere is there can be, in many cases, a disconnect between the labor and environment. So we could, like I mentioned, try to bring those two elements together. So that's just a little bit about the program, and just a couple of remarks on the presentations. I found them really super stimulating. One thing that Katerina said that really caught my attention was capacity building is instrumental. And that I like the sound of that, because we do, as I mentioned, quite a bit of capacity building across the sector at both the as I mentioned, factory and sectoral level. So that's great to hear that. You know, it gives me hope that we actually will be able to make a real contribution, that in many ways, the ways in which we work are going to fit very well into this environmental sphere. Also, the dialogue aspect is, I think, critically important, and we have quite a bit of experience in working to generate social dialogue. And I think from Karina's presentation, it also gives me quite a bit of hope, because I think this regenerative model that you discuss, it's just, in a way, it seems intrinsically better for workers. That it's not all about profits, which are responsible, honestly, for so many of the challenges in the sector that relate to working conditions. So, you know, low wages, high working hours, and stress. You know, a lot of that, if you trace it back, it goes back to the profit model and the fast fashion that you mentioned. So I really like the sound of this regenerative approach, because I think it just, by definition, it's really going to be better for the people who are involved in the production of the clothing, and also employers, not just workers. So I'll stop there. I'm also happy to answer any questions if there are any, but I think I'll just turn it back to you, Samantha. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was great to hear about the Better Work strategy, and yeah, look forward to seeing that go into fruition. So now it's time to open up for some questions. So I just checked the chat, and I can see none in the chat. So please have a think about some questions that you would like to ask Katerina, Karina, Anne, or Lindita. I'm going to ask Ian Miles if he would like to come in and offer some first comments as well, while people are collecting their thoughts. Professor Ian Miles from Manchester University.
Oh, thanks very much. Well, the first thing to say is that this has been a great discussion. I've learned a lot, both about issues and about some of the actions that people are undertaking and the networks that are being established in order to try to address some of these challenges. So that's really useful. I grew up in a town where the leather industry was predominant, and I can remember the smell. It's a very smelly industry, and I can also remember the color of the river at the bottom of the street I lived in, which was a very multicolored river. That industry has long gone from that town, and the environment is a lot better for that, but the memory stays with me to this day. So, you know, to hear discussion of similar sorts of issues, and to learn that, you know, Sweden is still confronting problems from 50 years ago, but even longer, is very salutary. So thank you for that. My own work tends to be on knowledge-intensive business services, and I think one thing is that these are private organizations that do things that might be done in other ways. They might be done through universities, through government laboratories, through advisory services run by governments, technology transfer organizations, and the like. The thing I would just like to say about them right now is that the roles can be a lot more than just advice. They can be providing information for strategy, yes, but they can also be helping to design things for people or with people, to implement designs and solutions, sometimes even to outsource things. You know, we're familiar with waste management services, for example, but far more sophisticated things can be outsourced. And there are a lot of these different sorts of activities that are underway, which can contribute to sustainability and to better work, of course. And yes, dialogue is extremely important, but perhaps dialogue is more than just words. There can be an interaction, and that will involve interpersonal interaction, to be sure, but it could also involve you know, procedures of trial and error, of developing ideas, of developing plans, of trying to put them into operation. There can be building of some of these very important visions that Karina was talking about, for example, the narratives about what sorts of future we might achieve, what sorts of future we don't want to achieve, and what the actions have to be that would lead us to a better and more sustainable world. And I think the point that I would make it in this context is that capability building, as Katrina was saying, is extraordinarily important here. And those capabilities have to be multifaceted and have to be distributed across many of the different stakeholders that we're talking about. That's a real challenge for the platforms. So we have to have the sort of technical capabilities to be able to figure out different ways of doing things, different designs, different technologies and the like. We have to have what innovation research calls absorptive capacities. The customer has to be able to understand what the product or solution is that they're being offered and make effective use of that. It's not going to be something that's just left on the shelf. And we need to have evaluation capabilities throughout the system, so people know that we're not just having processes of ticking boxes, people claiming that things have been done, their targets have been set and the like, that these things are actually really embedded in the organization, that we can monitor progress towards a realization of these objectives and the like. So those were some points that I had to make. And then I have a couple of questions to ask. One thing that was new to me was the Wayfinder method. And I don't know really what is involved in this. Maybe Katrina could expand briefly on this. And also on she has 3 case studies of platforms. So I understand that issues of access are always really important when you're organizing case studies, but maybe what sorts of common things and what sorts of differences might we expect across the case studies would be an issue. I'd like to ask Katrina. And for Karina, she rightly stresses the importance of narratives and having new visions, I suppose we could have it, of how to organize economic ecosystems. The big challenges I see right now is that we're in a world where there are very active agents providing disinformation and trying not so much to set up their own visions and narratives, but to try to undermine the idea that there is a truth. For example, it's the ideas of alternative facts, that any narrative will go. How do we establish resilient, stable narratives in a world where there's a huge amount of effort going on in social media and unfortunately through some KIBs themselves, active in public relations and lobbying and areas like that, to try to you say that for every fact there is a countervailing fact, for every narrative there's a countervailing narrative, and there's no truth that we can rely on anymore. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was very pointed comments. And I just think we just have one question in the chat, and I thought, Aaron, would you like to come up and ask the question, or would you like for me to read it out, and then we can ask Katerina and Karina to respond. So Aaron has asked, do we have a practical example of scalable greening of factories and how to scale up from a practical level? So we have great ideas here, but the missing link is who will pay for this, especially as the business model is purely contractual, transactional. As the second presenter pointed out, no ownership of the industry by those with the funds and the will to pay for it, i.e. the brands versus suppliers with narrow margins. So, Katerina, would you like to
Sure.
come in and reflect on those comments, and then we'll go to Karina?
Most definitely. Thank you so much to Ian and to Aaron also. Practical examples. I mean, from the research so far, there are definitely examples of, should we say, factories that have taken on the programs, the complete approach that the various initiatives have promoted to them, and actually continued it also after the engagement with the initiatives have been concluded. But I can't really tell you, I don't really have the data on whether these are scalable, what is the difference, why did some factories succeed with this and why did others not? Definitely, if a lot of technical upgrading is required, then definitely a cost is an issue. And in some initiatives, I know that some funding has been made available through the project or through developing agencies. But so I can't fully answer that question. There are cases, but that I don't really have a very specific answer, because I mean, as you point out, the business model where, shall we say, most of the profits end up with the brands and not with the factories that are producing, that is a huge challenge. And I'm not looking at that very specifically at the moment in my research, but thanks so much for the point. And Ian, case studies. Yes, I mean, my goodness. The similarities that I'm bringing forth is that I'm trying to look at the case studies from Bangladesh. So I try to narrow it that way. But then also the good news is that in gathering the information, most of them are, publicly funded, so that the reports, the plans, the evaluations are all fairly readily available, which is an advantage for me. But I've only started scratching the surface on that topic. I would be happy to continue the dialogue with you, Ian, on this, because it would be very helpful, because I do see already, KIBS as a way of kind of trying to make the technical capacity building an even more significant, give it a more significant role in the various incoming initiatives in the future. But I wanted to also, with regards to Wayfinder, quickly share the picture here. And I'll put the link in the chat. This is kind of a quick overview. They by gathering interactively a number of stakeholders, you build a coalition for change, where you then try to create an understanding of the system dynamics, explore these further, and then develop innovative strategies for change that will not deplete the biosphere. And if the last point of learning how to move forward, how to adopt the strategies, the innovations, etc. There's very, very many components. There's about 40 components to the process. But I will put the link in the chat, and it's a fairly new approach. There are, to my knowledge, there's 2 consultancies that are, actually working with not only textile brands, but with industry by applying this. And one consultancy is in Australia, and the other one is in Sweden, in Stockholm. And so if anybody is interested in further information, I'll be happy. Just drop me a line and I'm happy to provide you with more info. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Karina, would you like to come in and offer some comments?
So I'll start with Ian's question about narratives and new visions, and how, in this world of misinformation and cross-information, how do we, find truth? And I think that, there are many truths. Maybe I'm just coming from that perspective. And, the question of social dialogue is really important here, where we actually can speak to one another and find shared values and shared common understanding of what the issues are that we're facing. And so those narratives can spread in that way, from actually those starting from conversations, dialogue, moving through together, in the true meaning of dialogue, is how I see it. Because actually the diversity in those thinking is actually necessary for us to come to new understandings. So if we can create those spaces where we are having those conversations, where the visions come clashing against one another, then something new can arise. Then we're regenerating. So that sort of is my thoughts on that. In terms of the greening and scalability, it's a really good question. Like, what is it that we want to scale, and how do we want to scale as well? Rather than scaling up, perhaps we can be scaling out instead. And so it's, thinking about it in a slightly different way, that, these businesses perhaps could be too big as well, and how do we scale them in a way that is actually appropriate for the environment which we're in. So there are some really good examples within the industry that are starting to emerge, and one in particular is Cytex, which is a company in Vietnam. And what they've done is, rather than having, they're very green in terms of their technology and also their materials. However, just in terms of their how they approach what it means to scale this idea of sustainability is, you know, they're reaching into their communities and saying what is needed there. And that's how they're scaling out their sustainability. You know, one of their, in their community that, you know, people who have disabilities or, you know, they don't get work. And so this was an issue for them to say, well, that in itself isn't, needs to be addressed. And so they actually formed a factory that was, you know, had different machines which were catering to different abledness. So that's one part, but also within scale as well. You know, they have opened up a facility in Los Angeles, which is really close to their customer, so that they can create small runs and test their product within the community that they're selling to. And then from there, they make decisions about whether or not they'll buy larger scale. And that is actually manufactured in Vietnam. So it's testing, like Ian was saying, it's testing the market and testing, you know, what is required rather than just predicting and, you know, and also, you know, not really understanding your customer and just making. So that's another part of the greening or producing things that are truly sustainable, is actually knowing your customer and providing services to them that allow, you know, conversations and, you know, true relationships to build. So that sort of answers a little bit of the question. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could speak about and other ways. But I do see another question in the chat as well. So Sam, if you want to.
Sorry, I'm just thinking, I'm just conscious that we've gone over time. So I can see, yes, there's some questions around proliferation of networks and also gender equality, how to encourage women's participation in green skills and green technology that's developed, I guess, as part of the sustainability process. Did you want to take just some very last quick comments on either of those two issues, Katerina or Karina?
I could speak about the point on how important the institutionalization of social dialogue is, because I really think that it is really important to give many of these dialogues the legitimacy that they need in order to actually contribute to policy change. Because if the dialogues are merely dialogues amongst various stakeholders and do not reach policy level, you know, then that's not what I hope that they would create. And I think to include workers in that, through either workers specifically in facilities or through unions, it's my sense is that in many of the initiatives that I'm analyzing, that they have involved workers in that, and it has been a stimulation. But then how to institutionalize this to make it effective in countries so that it's not these should we say case studies in various places, that I think is the key. And about the encouraging women's participation in green skills, green technology, that is also a social question. It's very much about how does the educational system in various countries support this kind of training and female students in here. So they are linked, and by perhaps working in a factory, that would be a way of supporting such a transition. It's a decent work issue as I see it. It's also a just transition issue but very important. I'm not focusing on that specifically in my research, but the elements are definitely there. Yeah. Thank you for the good questions.
Thank you. Karina, any final comments?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in terms of women's participation. You know, the fashion and textile industry is, you know, is mostly women working in it. And so, you know, it's a really awesome, I mean, for one better word, like an excellent industry to be working on in terms of developing women's skills and capacities to create green developments for the future. And I think that, you know, the people that I've been speaking to are mostly women, and they're the ones who are making the change. And they're making the change not only in their businesses, but in their whole communities. And, you know, empowering women to participate in this transition is vital, I think.
Thank you very much, Katerina and Karina. Okay, well, we've come to the end of time. So my last task is to ask our ILO colleague, Dr. Cristina Martinez, to make some closing comments from the ILO. Away to you, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you for the presentations today. I remember when we started designing the project, this project, we thought about the challenging task of how could we have a critical voice running through the project, because the project evolves and the thinking as well. But if you don't design, or if you don't have in mind the sustainability of the efforts that you are taking with any of the actions that we are undertaking towards beyond the end of the project, then you run the risk of locking in certain ways of thinking and certain ways of doing things. And I think we come up with this idea of associating science with industry policy work, and the PhD awards as part of the project, I think, are doing exactly what we thought that we needed as this critical voice running through and challenging us to think in perhaps in a different way. Katarina asked us, is this how we want to develop our economies? She not only asked us about this, she shows what happens when you don't do it, and for how long the legacy is still with us. And we don't have more time. We really don't at this stage. And it's great to hear also from Karina about living systems as a framework for the factory of the future, something that some business or brands are already trying on. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when this scalability down or out or wherever you want to mention is going to happen, because I think many of the brands and the business in this industry are already moving and trying to find how they move. And Lindita from the Fashion Charter also talked to us about that, and Anne from Better Work, which is a very important program of the ILO, also moving towards closing this gap. I think it's very interesting also to see how the partnerships for the garment industry are moving beyond just looking at textiles, garments, and the value chain. If you remember listening to Lindita, how she was talking about coal phase out. I mean, we are of course focusing a lot on just energy transition, and now we are closing the gaps, and the circles as well. Coal phase out is also for the garment factories. It's not just for energy. So this is are important linkages for us. I just want to finish. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for putting together this conversation. It's not the last one. In fact, in a sense, it's the first one. But the inspiration also goes beyond the project. It's the work of the PhDs goes into progressive science revision of previous research and scaling up also new research and new scholars that will continue the work beyond certainly the project and the project of the PhD candidates here that I think we all want to wish you absolutely the best and to come back to us with results and the progress on results. I also want to thank you, Dr. Samantha Sharp, for your motivation and your energy on creating an environment that allows innovation to be at the center, at the core of what we do. And this inspiration also has brought many of the partnerships that we have today in the project. And I want to thank you, UTS, Damian, Stuart, the top of the management, for the support to our project, also to the ILO teams that are here with us and are working towards not only the environment but an integrative approach with other areas of the project, as our Deputy Regional Director mentioned earlier. And thank you also to the colleagues from the Swedish Development Agency. I think you all know the core of innovation. And I remember very well those times of the OECD innovation strategy when I was working there with Sweden, because really the core of the innovation thinking was coming from there, and to see that support from SIDA to this project is really an enormous appreciation from all of us. Thank you, Samantha. Over to you. I'm not sorry if I'm forgetting any thank you, but you can do the rest.
Okay. Thank you, Christina. And yes, I'd like to also say my thank you to all the speakers today, Katarina, Karina, Anne, and Lindita. Thank you for contributing your time and your insights. It's very valuable. We've had a lively discussion today, and I hope this continues through our work. Just a few, I guess, notes at the end. If you'd like to keep up to date with the further outputs of the Decent Work in the Garment Sector Supply Chains project, particularly the environmental outcome, I would encourage you to look at our Just Transition Toolkit. So this toolkit, we're pulling together all of our work, all of our outputs in terms of thinking and planning for just transition in the sector. And so I've popped the link for that one in the chat. And also more broadly, please look at the Asian Garment Hub, which is another outcome from the project. Output from the project. It's a one-stop place for industry, data, news, resources, tools, a mechanism for connecting people and organisations across the sector, all with the aim to make a fairer, more sustainable garment sector in Asia. So I've also put the link to that, the Asia Garment Hub, in the chat as well. I'd like to thank my ISF colleagues who helped me with the organisation of this seminar, Ettore, Tanya, Amber from our comms team. Also, Damien, thank you very much for your support, and other colleagues. I mentioned that this seminar is the first of a series. So later in the year, we're also looking to hold another seminar, this one focused on the Pacific, and specifically looking at labour mobility and sustainable agriculture, as well as circular economy opportunities in the Pacific Island states. So stay tuned later in the year when we'll share more details of this seminar. And one last thank you is to everyone on the call for joining us today. And I wish you a great rest of the evening, afternoon, or day, wherever you are located in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, Karina and Katarina. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Sam.
See you. Well
See you.
done. It was great.
Thank you. Thanks for your support.
See you tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.